Welcome to the HR Uprising podcast. This podcast series explores HR hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life HR, learning, and OD professionals. The HR Uprising is about learning through collaboration and evidence-based action. We want colleagues to have the confidence and skills to rise up through their organizations by delivering real, lasting business value. Now, introducing your host, chartered psychologist, experienced change agent, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach, Lucinda.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the HR Uprising podcast. And I'm really excited because this is one of our newest formats today, and it's our first What Does the CEO Really Want from HR interview. I'm delighted that Craig Marshall has joined me today. He's actually the CEO of OrganOx, and we go back quite a long way because I know him from our days when he was MD of Siemens Magnetic Technology, and he used to come along and support the leadership development programs that we used to run. So I know that he has a real insight and empathy for the importance of people management and also the value that HR can bring. So I felt that Craig would be a great person to kick this off. Before we go into the sort of questions, Craig, would you like to just give a little bit of an introduction? Because you've got quite an interesting background. Over to you.
Oh, thanks, Lucinda. My first degree was in mechanical engineering from Liverpool. I then worked for Oxford Instruments as an engineer for 10 years. And then that business became partially acquired by Siemens. I moved across to Germany for 3 years. Actually then became a project manager, and quite late in my career, not until my very early 40s, did I become a line manager. And that actually, I think, on reflection, helped me enormously to have 20 years of being managed. I think was a great way to know what good and what bad line management felt like. And then once I became a line manager, I quite rapidly ascended. So by the age of 47, I was managing a business of 450 people. So I've been a departmental director, and then after a couple of years became the managing director of Siemens Magnetic Technology. So then at age 53, I then left the big corporate world, my choice, and joined OrganOx, which is a spin-out of Oxford University. I was the second CEO. It spun out in 2008. I joined in 2016, just done now 3 years in this role, and we've taken the team from 12 to 25, and we're on track for revenues of around £3 million this year from a standing start when I started 3 years ago. So really getting some nice traction. The product is in the area of liver transplantation, where we're really responsible for a paradigm shift in the practices of how livers are assessed, and we're also altering the life-work balance of surgeons by giving more flexibility to when the surgery takes place, and some of our customers are having to do nighttime surgery, for example. So a very exciting product, long way to go yet, and there are other applications outside of transplantation we're looking at.
That's really exciting in terms of, I know you've got a real passion for the product, and it's a variation on healthcare from the magnets that was all for do with the MRI scanners. So you were still in healthcare, weren't you, with Siemens? But I suppose switching this on to HR, along your way of your career, I'm guessing that it was self-managed, but was there any influence from any HR or people development professionals that supported you in your career journey?
Yeah, so whilst I was at that in those first 20 years, I did the MBA distance learning at Warwick. I remember how rewarding it was to study HR, and particularly organizational behavior was a real passion of mine, which was, I sort of was rather dismissive about that sort of fluffy stuff as an engineer until I really studied it at quite a high level. And that was a sort of epiphany for me in figuring out what could be done by working closely with a team and getting the best out of the team.
Just in terms of that, Craig, so I think that's something that many of us might, have worked in engineering organisations where the HR stuff is seen as a bit fluffy and nonsense, and then you were converted.
Yeah.
What could someone have said to you to have converted you earlier, if you like, if we're working with people who are cynical?
So I think what would have really helped me to have had it more easily articulated was the motivational theory of Hertzberg, and why work here, why work harder, was something I learnt about in my 30s, which if somebody had explained that to me in my 20s, I would have given a turbo effect in my career. Motivating people to work harder is not about paying them more, as I'm sure everybody listening to this will understand. It wasn't obvious to me as a young engineer that was the case, that it's much more subtle, it's much more nuanced than that, and to get to understand what drives people on an individual level at a particular time in their career, that those individual needs and anchors change over the course of a career, and figuring out that this is a much more complex equation to solve would be the way in which I think it would have been more easily digested for me in my career.
And I guess being given the theories, that would appeal to you as a scientist, as an engineer. The theory, you could then see why it was logical to understand people better, understand what their self-actualization was, and apply to it.
Exactly. So once I realized the sort of canon of science, really, and rigor that had gone into this field, then I was I was really turned on by that. Because I was ignorant of that as an engineer. I'd not been exposed to that in my undergraduate degree at all.
That makes sense. And so I suppose that's a take home for us is being more having the theories at our fingertips, being able to share those, or the evidence being more evidence based, might help bring a broader group of people along with us when we're trying to support.
I think with a pretty educated workforce, I think the potential risk for the HR community is they dumb down their field to the point that it is lost, and I think we should not do that. I think there's every reason to provide quite a sort of sophisticated education to relatively sophisticated people. And I think that might work better than less is more. I think more might be more when it comes to HR theory.
That's really useful. Yeah, more might be more, so don't dumb it down. So moving into, I think it's quite interesting because you've been in two different businesses, and obviously we have listeners where they are solo HR professionals. I suppose if we stick with OrganOx, which is an SME, yeah. I mean, do you have HR in there yet?
No, we don't. We have a consultancy on a retainer helping us with policies, but we, out of a staff of 25, we have not yet appointed a full-time HR or even a part-time HR person.
So you need someone to come and do the transactional things. So does that mean it's falling to you, the sort of more people strategic aspect, or do you see that it's something? At what point do you think you get to a critical mass that you need HR support, and what kind of support?
I think it'll be in the next year where we will move away from a third-party consultancy that's helping with our policies, and so we're working with recruiters. In terms of mid-year reviews, end-of-year reviews, we're handling that ourselves. We're in an ISO 9001 business, so we've got a level of there's a few SOPs in the system, but where I'm really wanting to move on to in an HR perspective is much more about figuring out what we've got inside the heads of the people in the senior management team and everywhere else in the business. We have no policy today to reward inventors, quite and we need to do that. We've got no referral rewards scheme in place. So things like that need to happen.
So I suppose it's interesting for me here. I'm curious because I think often in smaller sized organisations, the first HR person that comes in, they get given all the transactional stuff to do. Yet actually what you're describing there, well, actually, I think it's actually you're saying to reward inventors. It's about someone who can think in an organisational development point of view, almost a creative point of view as to how you might come up with the incentive scheme, as opposed to the nuts and bolts of how you implement it. Or that's what I inferred from that. And I'm just, is that the case, or do you think you know that and you just want someone to make it happen?
No, what's in my mind is bringing somebody in at the senior management team level and not a manager reporting outside of the senior management team. I need somebody in the senior management team wearing the HR hat. Yeah.
So you'd want them to think there's a difference in terms of the style of thinking from. So what would be, if you were to describe what you'd be looking for in that kind of person, that would be interesting for people to think about the skills they need to develop to be at that level.
So I'd like somebody who's stress tested, somebody who's, I think, come from a company that's much bigger than this one, and being a part of a senior team, working across a pretty diverse team that understands this company's got to grow, and what's the HR answer to that growth question. So, if I go around the table, I'll be challenging the commercial director, how we're going to grow the business, and then throw that challenge out to the whole team, and the commercial director will come back with a sales forecast, which is obviously going to be growing. Then the operations people will come back and say, and this is the supply chain and how we're going to meet the challenge of the growing sales. The regulatory people will recognize the new registrations we might need in different territories, growth in different new areas. R&D will be bringing in new products, but all of that needs to happen with a team that will be growing itself. And I'm answering the question, so what's the team we need? And I really need an HR professional to be there figuring out what the right team is. And it's not necessarily just getting the same team to work harder. It's maybe there's some people that can ascend, some that won't ascend, some that are in the wrong job today and need to be in a different job tomorrow. All of that, I'll have an opinion, but I'm not a professional HR. So somebody who's in the business at a senior level, figuring out, having got to know the people in the business, and then relating what they've learned about the people to the future, and figuring out where should all these people go to in the future? What's their career trajectory, and how do we make sure that works out for them and for the company in a mutual way? That's what I'm looking for in an HR director. Does that help?
Yes. What I was interested in there, Craig, was the way you said you would like them to understand the people and where to take them in the business, as opposed to saying, we've got a 5-year plan and how do the people meet that requirement? And I'm just curious about which comes first. And so it's nice to hear it that way. I imagine they need to do both, but I'll just reflect that one back to you.
Yeah, so I definitely see this as a two-way street. With a small dynamic business like this, it's, I think, naive to think we can just instantly turn off a particular person and find somebody who's brilliant and perfect in every respect. That's not the real world. So figuring out what we've got and understanding the potential of everybody is really key to the success of a business. I've also been in businesses where, not this one, but where there has been a much more hardline approach to people who aren't considered to be ideal, and they are let go of quite quickly. And if that happens too brutally, there is collateral damage for those that are remaining, and that can erode the goodwill in a company. So I'm conscious of that. So I think it's having a degree of empathy, and it can be ultimately pay big rewards in the way a business grows. Nobody's perfect, and I'm first to admit that.
And a real growth mentality then, basically looking at what people's strengths are and how they can contribute to the future, and then you plug the gaps as opposed to going for the perfect fit of a jigsaw and out with the old sort of thing. It's growing together.
Yeah, and I think one benefit of an SME over a large corporate is there's much more tolerance of diversity. Large corporations talk about diversity, but are pretty poor at it in practice. We can, I think, deal with a much wider range of people in an SME than a large corporate. I mean,
yeah, I think I see that. Yeah, because you want to make. It's funny when I asked that question before about actually whether you start with who you've got and move forwards, or vice versa. Having been in a large company, we both have, and in an SME as well, I'm thinking, of course, that's exactly what you do, because you want to make the most out of these people who are engaged, and but you do have to. That doesn't mean you take them with all their foibles, right? But value those. It's really about valuing the differences and making the most of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, and I suspect this might be going back into some of your larger organisation experience. When you look to an HR professional about the role to play, I mean, certainly what we've talked about there, you've talked about them being part of the senior management team, understanding your people, understanding how to get the best out of them in line with where their careers are going and where the business strategy is. Do you, or have you looked for any other role from HR professionals in the past?
So I look at it on three levels. So there's the HR is helping me understand the individuals in the business. But more than that, there's a second level, which is then figuring out what's the best team dynamic that we can organize here. And even if we've got an existing team which might not be fully functional, I would look for the HR person to come to the table with some team building which might address the identified issues.
Yeah.
So if there's I don't know, some engineers who really have a problem with the commercial people, then we absolutely put that to the challenge in a team building exercise and make sure they've got to work together. And make sure that the two departments that are very cozy already we're not just reinforcing that one. That's not the objective here. So there's the three levels would be individual, team, and I think in a company, particularly an SME, I'd like to think that there is no glass ceiling for HR as a function, and that it really gets into the boardroom as well. And that's not often the case, actually. That an SME will have an HR presence in the boardroom, and there's a sort of tacit understanding that NEDs don't need any help from an HR perspective, and I think it's possibly not the case. So,
why do you think that is so prevalent, Craig? Because I know you do think you are the minority in how you think about the value of HR at executive level. It's an old adage, but it's lonely at the top, and HR can help with that issue. Yeah.
I think HR is in a business where you've got a small group of very successful NEDs who are trying to ensure that the executive are recognised, rewarded, remunerated correctly, and retained. That's often in the absence of HR. So the fate of the C-suite, the CEO, CFO, etc., is ultimately in the hands of some individuals who aren't necessarily, and quite generally aren't, HR professionals, and that seems a bit of a bias. And I'm fortunate in OrganOx. That's not, we've got help in that area, but I think if I listen to other CEOs and think about their respective experiences, it's not often the case that they are well catered for from an HR perspective.
And it's interesting, and I do think it's a bit chicken and egg, because often then they go, the stuff that you'll get from an HR, they'll go for the transactional stuff, which is painful, but it isn't the same sort of thing as the job that you've just described. It isn't necessarily the same person as the job that you described that you'd want.
Yeah.
So it's actually realising there's two lots of value. Yes, this HR got a great deal of value in taking away pain around sorting policies, etc., but also there's a different set about the value of maximizing the value of your people, basically. So if you think back to experiences you've had in the past with HR, have you got a great example where you've had value from working with HR, or they've contributed to one of the businesses you've been in?
Yes. So I moved from Oxford Instruments to Amersham. So this was Amersham PLC. At the time, it was, I think, the 50th largest business on the FTSE. It was later sold to GE, and I transitioned into GE Healthcare. But in Amersham, this was a very progressive PLC. And I remember the HR team was particularly impressive compared to what I'd been used to in a much smaller PLC at Oxford Instruments. And I remember distinctly a woman called Lucy Knights, actually, who I think is still working in an HR capacity.
I'll have to try and find her and see if we can get her to listen to this podcast.
I was struck by how strategic she was in her thinking, and she was absolutely on the senior management team, and she was no passenger at all. She was very much had a forthright opinion about many aspects of the business. It wasn't just an HR contribution she was making. She was making a contribution across the piece, but it was particularly well articulated when it was an HR topic. But you got the impression this was a serious intellectual person who knew exactly where the business was and where it was going, and all the challenges, not just the HR ones. But because she had that breadth of knowledge and appreciation of the challenges, she was particularly adding a huge amount of value when she did speak about HR matters. That was, for me, a best-in-class example.
That's really brought out two really good points there. So she felt she obviously was forthright, was the word you used. She had the courage to speak up and to contribute. So she felt she had her place, but she contributed across the piece. So she was listening to what was going on in the commercial area. She wasn't just in a narrow way. She was contributing across the piece.
Yeah, and she had access to that, and she used it to good effect. So I've seen other HRs who are in the room, but switch off when it's not their turn to talk.
Right.
Switch off.
So that's
not good.
That's a really good point, because actually I think that was one of the things that I was thinking, was it because there was a particularly supportive environment which helped her do it, or was that about her? But what I'm hearing there is you're saying that actually other people can come in and they clam up, or whether it's confidence or they're not interested, that's not adding value. What you've got to do is be completely engaged and interested across the business if you're engaged at this level.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Great. Is there anything else that you'd add in terms of more generally how HR can deliver most value? Because I think we have had quite good examples already of that. Is there anything else that you just come to mind that you'd say you'd like to see people do?
I'd like to see more innovation in HR. I think that the way in which we are so rapidly changing. I heard today, only today on the radio, about how in young people, Facebook is not even in the top 10 websites now for very young people. So
right, that YouTube's the number one, isn't it? I heard that this morning. That's all I heard on Radio 4.
So the way in which we are learning is so different across the decade. So I'm in my 50s, but 40s, 30s. I was last night at a dinner, and we were trying to sort some music out, and it was quite obvious. There was who had Spotify, who didn't have Spotify.
Yeah,
you could have just drawn an age limit on that. So I think HR need to be very much close to the action when it comes to the way in which we're choosing to learn and making sure that as we learn what an organization is and what it's not and where it wants to go, make sure we're tapping into the contemporary resources to do that. And so HR relationship with IT, I think, needs to be very much strengthened. I think there's a risk that they are left in the dark if they don't do that. And I don't think there's any excuse for saying, well, I'm not an IT person. I think it's part and parcel of being HR now is you've got to be an IT person to do your job. And that would be my challenge to the HR community.
That's a good one, because actually very often you hear HR being challenged to be more commercial, which I think we covered in the last point about contributing across the business, but actually being more technical, learning at the level. And
this is to be more technically savvy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, turning to maybe less positive experiences that we can learn from, have there been any frustrations? I don't know whether they're going to be the opposite of the things we talked about, but any frustrations or experiences where you'd like to see HR do something different?
I think much earlier on in my career, I was aware of behavioural issues in some senior managers, and they just weren't called out by HR. HR were not prepared to call it out and turned a blind eye. And I think that we need to ensure HR don't do that. And I think it's probably helping now. An obvious one would be to think about the Me Too movement, but not only. But I think just ensuring we're behaving properly is where, in the past, to your question, in the past I've thought HR could have had a stronger voice or a stronger will to open their mouth, but it didn't.
Do you think it is HR's responsibility, or is it everyone's responsibility, or and also why do you think they haven't?
So in those businesses, HR were not in the senior team, to be quite honest. So I don't think they felt that mandate. And I think
so. So that's part of it.
I think in terms of power, but that speaks to the point of empowering HR is a very good thing on many levels, and not only what they can bring to the table, but how they can help the executive ensure the culture is going to be conducive for success, because the executive might not even see it. And if you've not got the right positional power in the organization, the executive will continue to get away with it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a little bit chicken and egg, actually, in terms of, I saw a debate on this recently where people are saying, actually, you've almost got to be prepared to lose your job if you're going to have the integrity about doing this. But it's quite tricky, because often the behaviour is at a very senior level, which is affecting the culture. Yeah. And often it is more senior to the HR person. Yeah. Any other tips on how someone can do that? Because that is actually the reality in many places, that they might not have the positional power that's ideal to try and address something like that.
So I think the way to ensure that can happen relatively without too many dramas is to just couch it as a risk conversation. So executives, in my experience and direct experience, we need to recognize and respond to risks and opportunities. And if this is a understanding and think of risk as impact and probability, then if I'm an executive and just paint this worst case scenario, so if I've done something, or if I'm behaving badly, I don't know it to my team, and the HR director comes to me and points out that this is what's happening, this is the observation, and this has the impact, could have the impact of da-da-da, and I'm in a tribunal, and the probability of that, if we don't sort it out in the next month, is going to be at least 50%, and that's end of career, share price drops, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, all of those stuff, that would be helpful, to rather than say you really shouldn't be doing that, but to just put it in a business context. Why shouldn't you do it? What's the consequences? What's the business consequence? And that for an executive to understand that their legacy would be in tatters, not just their career, but their legacy. And the more senior you get, that's all about legacy. that's when the HR could really be a helpful voice if it's constructed in that sense.
That is such a brilliant insight, Craig, because I think that's so different from what answers that HR would have come up with, and it makes so much sense. It goes back to your point about how, if you've got a bunch of engineers, how do you convince them? It's about logic, calm business rationale or theory is the way to disengage and take any emotion out of it. So it's not you've been a bad boy because you're just not being very nice to people, again, which is fluffy. It's actually what are the consequences from a business point of view, and talking about risk is going to get a much better response. And that's great.
People who have the C-suite generally have a pretty big ego, and if you can highlight how that's going to be damaged, that could make a pretty good.
Yes. Highlight potential risk to ego. Absolutely. That makes sense too. Sorry, I was going to ask another follow-up question to that, but I was just thinking about that quite deeply. In terms of carrying on forwards, I guess just to sum up, because my next question is, what would you like to see in the HR department of the future? And I think you have already given some areas there. So just to give you a chance to see if there's anything extra that you'd add, because I've certainly heard you say you'd like them to be more innovative, more tech savvy. It is about developing people. It's about contributing to the broader business. It's about calling out bad behaviours and having the courage to do that. But actually, when I'm saying calling out, actually doing it in a controlled way, which people are going to listen to. And I've remembered my question. I was going to ask you about tools and things, but I'll let you answer this question first. Is there anything about the HR department of the future, anything else you'd add that you'd like to see?
Yes, it's a bit of a left field idea, but so little companies raise money from venture capitalists or high net worths, or they might have venture debt. They're generally the two sources of funds that little companies that are before they're profitable or before they've even got any revenues rely on, and that's their lifeblood. So I think what would be a really interesting thing to think about in the future, and I'm sensing there's a sort of undercurrent of what this could be, with big corporations, very big corporations, have CSR programs, of course, and the idea would be to
corporate social responsibility.
Yeah. So what's the sort of wacky idea would be to imagine a new source of funds for little businesses, particularly little businesses that are doing something good for society. That there might be an HR role in the future, which is creating a new source of funds, which I would call CSR capital. So it wouldn't take much money from a big corporate to go a long way with a little business. And for that money to be made available to these little companies, but it might not be just the money. It might be coming with a team building.
Human skills and things. Yeah.
So a big company might be helping a little company, giving it some money, but releasing some of its rising stars to help this little company get across the chasm to become profitable. So that would be, for me, a very exciting growth opportunity for the sector to harness the goodwill of big companies. Some big companies want to be seen to be doing good, and just giving money away is not necessarily the best thing they could do. But to have the HR facilitate programs that not only give the money away, but it's kind of a win-win where they're helping their rising talent help companies that are in maybe in a completely different field, but it could give them an accelerated growth by doing that. So I think it's a very wacky idea, but I think it's got some potential.
It's interesting that you say that, because one of my friends used to work for ARM, the electronics manufacturer piece, and they actually had almost a program where they'd go and let someone who was a sort of future leader, you had to be of a certain seniority, go out and work with some startups.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of concept, isn't it? It's that talent, but actually that was also developmental to the individual in question. They learn a huge amount about going out and working with a small business, because it is so incredibly different from being in a large global.
Absolutely.
So it's a sort of talent strategy, isn't it, really, from their point of view? Yeah. Well, great idea. And I say, I dare say, if there's people listening to this who want to roll in an exciting OrganOx in a year's time, they can listen to that. Or if they've got ideas about offering you talent, then they can look you up on LinkedIn, Craig. I dare say.
Great, yeah.
You never know. You never know who's listening. I will just go back to that conflict one, if you don't mind, just briefly before we wrap up, because I say this is a question that I know people have asked me to cover on a podcast, actually, because it's quite tricky. How do you deal with conflict and those sort of things? And I loved your answer earlier about couching it in a risk conversation. Do you see any other things? I know you mentioned maybe team building or 360 feedback, or are there any other tools that or HR or styles of intervention that you think would be useful to try in that circumstance?
Well, I'm a big fan of the one I learned when I was at Siemens, which is, so this is when if I've ever had to deal with dismissing somebody, the way I've done it, and I've actually done it, I won't name the company, but I did it with an HR professional, and that's observation, perception, impact. So to just cite certain observations as they were irrefutable observations, and then my perception of those observations and the impact that those perceptions are now being, how I'm behaving and how I'm thinking, is a very, very powerful way to essentially call somebody out when they're not doing what you're expecting them to do.
So that is basically good quality feedback. And so again, you're coming back to just have the courage to have that conversation and to give that feedback.
Yeah. And the other one, which is much softer, is the Johari window.
Yeah.
Which I like to do to obviously build trust, but it's a particularly powerful one. So I've witnessed that being deployed with two guys who've been working with each other for 20 years, and there were tears on both sides of the table.
Oh, really? How did they deploy it? Did they just do it with the two, or was a team, an overall team?
So it's, what I know about me that you don't know, and what I know about you that you don't even know. That sort of stuff, and just opening up the trust window, and people were declaring things that they really were very vulnerable. Declarations, and giving very open and honest feedback, and as I said, tears on both sides when that happened.
Wow. Was that facilitated by somebody? Was it in a small group, or was it just the two of them?
So we were taught the technique, and then we were left to it. And I was in a room, and there were other people in, it was just a bit like sort of a speed dating scene, I would imagine. And there were other people in different corners of the room, and one of the corners there was tears.
Oh, wow. Gosh, how interesting. Right. I thank you so much for your time there. Okay. In terms of wrapping up, is there anything else that you would summarise? They say, we talked earlier about the sort of people who are listening to the HR Uprising. There's a whole range. It's all across the people professions. Is there anything else that you'd suggest to them in terms of taking their career forwards or adding and contributing to businesses out there?
One of the things I often draw up, I'm quite a graphical person, is a neat little diagram which just simply shows it's a model which shows from day one of being a graduate to the day you're the CEO. And the only thing that's growing over time at the expense of everything else, which is shrinking over time, is your people skills. By the time you're the CEO,
it's that triangle diagram. I might try and dig it out and put it on the show notes that you used to show, didn't it? It's like a triangle, and you kind of learn the technical skills, then drop those and increase the people skills. That one.
Yeah, but you grow admin skills in the meantime, but they fall away, and ultimately, you're just left with people skills, and you manage the people, and the people manage everything else. And that's why HR is so important, because if you can't manage people, you can't do anything.
Completely, and you help other people to manage people, which is critical as well.
Yeah.
That's super. Craig, thank you so much for being our first guest in terms of what HR wants from what CEO wants from HR on the HR Uprising. I'm really very grateful to you for your time. I know that people will find lots of this of value. And then, is it okay for me just to put your LinkedIn profile, just put any details at the bottom of the show notes?
Yes, that's brilliant.
That's fine. So if anyone wants to link in with you or anything, then they can look you up.
Thanks, Lucinda.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucinda. My pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast. You can access more information, including resources or links mentioned in the show, at our website, www.hruprising.com. Also, you might want to join our LinkedIn community or tweet to us at HR Uprising. We'd love to hear from you.